I'm Maggie O'Farrell and my new book is called The Marriage Portrait. It's set in Renaissance Florence and it's about a young girl, Lucrezia, who marries the Duke of Ferrara. And the novel asks the question, what do you do if you suspect your husband is planning to murder you? The novel is about Lucrezia, who is a 16-year-old bride of the Duke of Ferrara. She spent her whole life in the gilded, secluded world of her father's court, but at the beginning of the novel, she finds herself at a remote country villa, realising that her husband has brought her here to kill her. So Lucrezia's husband is Alfonso. He's the new ruler of Ferrara. He's married Lucrezia in an act of political advancement to unite two ruling dynasties. He needs to exert his power over his new region, and he also needs very quickly a son and heir. I've always loved Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess, and I was rereading it a couple of years ago and I just found myself wondering whether it was based on real events. And I did a bit of research and very quickly I found the portrait of Lucrezia de' Medici, which I was immediately really struck by. As soon as I saw it and looked at her face, I knew that I had my next novel. My Last Duchess is a magnificent piece of work. There's not a word or a syllable out of place, and it's a fascinating investigation into a certain mindset. But I wanted my novel to be the poem's inverse in a sense, because the woman, the bride, in the poem doesn't speak. She is just a smiling portrait. So I wanted to bring Lucrezia out from behind the Duke's curtain and to allow her to tell her own story. There's only one portrait of Lucrezia in existence, and it's attributed to the school of Bronzino. It has a very dark background, and Lucrezia is pictured wearing a black dress, probably in deference to the recent death of her father-in-law. She's also wearing both Medici and Este jewellery, so it does symbolise her destiny as uniting these two dynasties. And it's very typical of Bronzino's quite almost photorealistic style, but usually in his portraits his subjects tend to have quite a blank expression, but I find Lucrezia's portrait mesmerising because she looks anxious, she looks nervous, she looks as if she has something she wants to tell us. I think readers of The Marriage Portrait will find weddings and palazzos and paintings and various kinds of beasts and interesting journeys, enigmatic husbands. Also, I think they will find it's a novel about hope and the resilience of the human spirit. Well, I finally made it to Italy almost when I'd finished the novel, right at the end of lockdown, and I managed to visit the various locations of the book, the palazzos and the castellos and the country villas. So all these buildings and locations which both protect and cage Lucrezia during the novel. I also went in search of her portrait, which was not as easy as I thought it might be. Her family were all painted by Bronzino, and most of them are hanging in a special room in the Uffizi Gallery. Lucrezia is not there. She is in quite a small room, a distant room in a different gallery, and she's quite low down on the wall and almost behind a fire extinguisher. So it took some detective work to find her. I also, just before I left, managed to visit Lucrezia's grave, and I left flowers on it for her. Well, most of the writing of The Marriage Portrait was bookended almost exactly by the pandemic. So it's no coincidence that it's a novel quite concerned with constraint and lack of choice. I did have extraordinary luck though, because during all the lockdowns I was able to travel in my imagination to one of the most intriguing and dazzling periods in history. I think for most women in that time of Lucrezia's class and social standing, their destiny was to make an advantageous marriage for their family, and Lucrezia's father, Cosimo, was certainly no exception to that rule. He arranged marriages for all of his daughters. Where he was different, I think, though, that he does seem to have had great respect for women. He absolutely adored his wife, and very unusually, he was not only faithful to her, but he ceded his power to her during his fairly regular absences from Tuscany. And crucially, he educated his daughters alongside his sons. So Lucrezia and her sisters were very fortunate enough to have possibly the best education that money could buy. So Lucrezia meets a tiger when she is fairly young, and it was actually the first part of the book I ever wrote. It was my way in, I think, looking back to her character, to her as a child, certainly. I read that her father Cosimo kept a menagerie in the bottom of the palazzo, and in fact her mother allegedly hated it. It wasn't one of the reasons she wanted to move, because she hated the smell, particularly on hot days. But I also noticed that there are very few depictions of tigers in Renaissance art. There are more lions and you could shake a stick at, but no tigers. I think possibly because no one had ever seen one. So when I was writing the scene where Lucrezia encounters her father's tiger, I was trying to imagine what it would be like to see a tiger, having no previous idea of what it looked like. You know, when we see a tiger, it's an astonishing experience, but we know what to expect almost. But what would it be like to encounter such an animal having had no idea what it would look like? The palazzo in the novel is based on the Palazzo Vecchio, which is a large crenellated building in the centre of Florence at the corner of a piazza. It has a kind of dual personality, I think, because from the outside it's incredibly uniform, very strong. It looks like a fortress with a big bell tower. But on the inside it's this quite complicated and exquisite building. There are these vast staterooms and lots of private apartments, very ornate, painted, frescoed rooms opening out from each other. There's also a warren of secret passages where the family could have escaped if they were in danger. Writing the marriage portrait did feel quite different from writing Hamnet, partly because the world in which I was writing it, which was 2020 and 2021, was completely different. You know, it was unrecognisable for many reasons. But even though the marriage portrait takes place approximately 30 or 40 years before Hamnet took place, the life of a Florentine principessa is so distant and so far removed from the life of a small boy in rural Warwickshire. Even though they inhabit the same century, their lives were so incredibly different.